Hey, welcome back to another episode. Adrian here from Photography, and in this episode I want to take a look at some of the past images I've taken and share some stories behind the images. Before I started this YouTube channel, I took a lot of pictures and created a lot of images with film in some really cool places. So I want to start a new series where I talk about some of the stories and share some of the stories behind the images, and then take a look at the pictures and why I like them as well. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the 3 different film stocks I used when I was in Kauai and used my Hasselblad and shot some medium format film. So I picked out some of my favorite images from that trip, so we'll take a look and I'll share the stories of and talk about the places where I took those pictures. We'll talk about the film stocks as well as the composition of the images and why I like them as well. So all the digitized film I have was on a hard drive which got damaged and was unreadable by my computer. So I sent it in to get it repaired, and so while it's getting repaired and getting shipped back, it was a huge bummer and a big inconvenience. So I'm gonna have to rescan these images, but luckily I have all my film saved in these 2 big medium format film books. So I keep all my negatives and slide film in there. So I just went through and picked out some of my favorite images from my Kauai trip. So I'm gonna rescan them and then we can take a look at them, and I'll just talk about the pictures and share kind of behind the scenes of the pictures. So I shot 3 different film stocks while I was in Kauai. I used a Cinestill 50 daylight, a Portra 400, and then a Kodak Ektachrome color slide film as well. So I'm gonna scan the images one at a time. I'll share the story behind the picture and talk about the image as well. So with all that said, let's get started. So I've picked out some of my favorite shots. I have here some Kodak Ektachrome 100 super fine grain color slide film, which looks really good. And I have really cool images there. And then I have some Cinestill. This one's Portra 400. Got some shots on Kalalau beach, which is where you have to hike to on the Nā Pali Coast. It's an 11-mile hike, and it's a pretty hard hike. At that time, it's probably the hardest hike I've done up to that point, just because there was a really diverse terrain. We were walking through mud, up and down, like along cliffs, along rocks. You're on this like coast in Hawaii. We had to cross this really deep river. So yeah, the terrain was pretty gnarly. It took us, we went 6 miles to camped there, and then another, no, I guess it's 11 miles one way, sorry, so 22 miles round trip, which is just really beautiful beach, just like off on the coast. And the only way you can get to it is by hiking there, or I guess you could go by boat, but then there's no dock, there's no way to get a boat to the beach because it's a pretty like gnarly beach. It's people have died there a lot from just getting washed out. It's a pretty dangerous trail as well, just because you have to walk along a cliff with a straight drop off, like a 50 to 70 foot drop off of a cliff into the ocean. So rocks have fallen and hit people and killed them. There's goats, like wild goats on the trail, and a lot of times goats will kick rocks from above and they'll hit people and they'll fall off the cliff. So it's very, very exposed, like the most exposed trail I've been on. So overall the terrain was gnarly. It was a lot of endurance. It was really hard just overall, but the views were definitely worth it, and I definitely want to do it again. So yeah, along that trail, I took this shot that's probably my flagship favorite shot of the entire trip. It's just you took it with Cinestill 50 daylight, and it's just a really cool shot of the Nā Pali Coast meeting the ocean, and the ocean's really blue, clear blue sky with a green tropical mountain. So it's really cool. So anyway, I'm gonna scan each of these images one at a time, and then we'll just take a look at them and I'll talk a little bit about the composition and the film stock, and then we can go from there. So while I was in Kauai, I only brought with me, at the time, the only film camera I had, which was my Hasselblad 500C. And so I had it in my backpack, and I'd whip it out and use my light meter and then the different film stocks to take my pictures. And I won't go into it a lot, but I'll make another video where I talk more about how I found my style and talk about how the style of photography I like to shoot, which I describe as a candid landscape photography, which isn't like a normal term you'd hear. It's just something I kind of came up with for myself. And I definitely have experienced that candid landscape photography while I was in Kauai using my Hasselblad. And a normal angle of view on my Hasselblad is 80 millimeters, which is the same as 50 millimeters, a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera or a 35 millimeter camera. So 50 millimeter lens is considered normal angle of view, which means it's closest to like how we see the world with our eyes as humans. Anything wider than 50 millimeters, and again, this is on a 35 millimeter or full frame camera. Anything wider than that is considered a wide angle, and anything smaller than that is telephoto. So like 200 millimeters would be a telephoto lens. So with my Hasselblad, because it's medium format, the normal angle of view is 80 millimeters, which is what I shoot mostly. That's probably the most common. I have a 120 millimeter lens, which is a slight telephoto, but I mostly use this 80 millimeter just because I like that natural angle of view. So I'll talk about my candid landscape photography and discovering my own style in another video, but that's something that I developed and gained experience with during this trip, shooting these landscapes. I wasn't trying to create some surreal landscape with long exposure, but more just like how you'd see it with your natural eye. So this Hasselblad 500C with my 80 millimeter lens is a great camera to create the kind of images I like to make. I have this ground glass I can use so I can really get the depth and see my composition through the lens, which is a really enjoyable experience for me. I'm gonna scan this film, my favorite shots from Kauai, one at a time. I use this air blowing device to get rid of some dust, and then a cotton glove so I don't get my fingerprints on the film. And oftentimes I use a plastic holder that you put the film in, and it covers up the film stock edges so you just get the exposure. But I'm gonna put the film directly on the scanner so that I can scan the outer edge and get the film stock in the image as well, just because I kind of like when I share my images, that way you can see the film stock, you know for sure it's film. So let's start with the Cinestill 50 Daylight, which is a unique and really cool film stock. The Cinestill is actually old film movie to make movies like motion pictures. So cinema film that is expired and then repurposed and put through another chemical process and made ready to use for stills. So it's it's kind of unique that way. Cinestill is the company. They buy the old cinematic film and then repurpose it to shoot for still images. So I'd say it's very similar to Fuji Pro. I would say it's as fine grain as Ektar 100, but the color profile is more closely resembles Fuji Pro outdoor film. So it kind of has like a, I don't know how to describe it, pretty saturated color profile, yet it's still fine, very fine grain. And it's ISO 50, so that'll be a fine grain. So this is one of my favorite, if not my favorite image that I took on the trip. So I'm starting with the best one here. Just got to make sure we have no dust. So I'm just going to scan it, then we can take a look at it. right, so I just scanned my Nā Pali Coast Cinestill 50 daylight color negative film scanned. So let's just take a look at it real quick. You have like a cliff going downward into the ocean, or just going down. Maybe you're taking a picture of the side of a mountain or something like that. I don't line it up in the corners. I always leave some space from the top of the cliff or mountain to the top of the frame. So I just tried to even this exposure out and this composition so that all the shapes were kind of evenly organized, so that it was kind of appealing to look at. So something to notice too is when I set the exposure, is I kind of overexposed it a little bit, and in the bottom right corner you can see the part of the cliff, it's pretty much just black, not exposed at all, versus maybe the top left side or the horizon sky. It's a lot more brighter, so you have some detail and get some good light pretty much in the entire composition except for the bottom right corner, which is just black and dark out. I could have made it more exposed, longer time, or more open aperture to get some detail in the bottom right corner, but I wanted to make sure that I focused on the cliff and the water versus just that bottom right corner. So I just like the look of it. It's super sharp, fine grain, and just looks really good. So let's go ahead and move on to another Cinestill image. So I have a waterfall here, which was right near the camp, 6.5 miles in on the Kalalau trail along the Nā Pali Coast. So the trail was called the Kalalau Trail. The Nā Pali Coast is just the whole coastline on that north side of Kauai. And we went on a little hike to this waterfall. It was one of the tallest waterfalls I've ever seen. It was low light, so I had to use a slower shutter of about 1/30 or 1/60th of a second with my aperture wide open, but I was still able to get some good shots. So this is another Cinestill 50D. That's daylight. So I'm gonna go ahead and scan this one. We can take a look. So this is a good composition. If you look at this image, I centered the waterfall right in the middle, and it was kind of bright, but I didn't want to overexpose it, because if you look at the top of the sky, it's just bright and pretty much whited out. And then the bottom left corner of the image is dark. So I feel like I kind of balanced out the exposure between the lights and darks, but got the proper exposure on the waterfall, which is like the center and, you know, the main part of the image. And then I didn't align, so if you look at the top line of the cliff, it doesn't go to the corner, but I put some space in there. So I kind of just arranged my composition to get a good looking kind of, composition with the waterfall centered, but the top of the cliff, shaped kind of correctly with some space on the top edges. So I think it turned out really cool. I would say this is another example of a candid kind of landscape approach that I took. I didn't use a long exposure. It's handheld. It's a fast shutter. You kind of see it. You don't see the whole waterfall. You don't see the bottom of it, but you can tell it's big and long, and you can see the green cliff, and I just kind of like the way it looks. So this is again on Cinestill 50 daylight, and I think it turned out really well. I have this on a t-shirt with the film stock on it, so it's something, if you want to check it out, I have a link below to my shop from my website. You can check it out. So I'm gonna move on. I'd also like to mention that all the images you see in this video, I scan them and then I put them in Lightroom and edit them, process them a little bit. Whether I shoot digital film, I'll kind of tweak it a little bit. So anyway, all these are post-edited, processed in Lightroom after I digitize them. All right, so let's look at this next image using Kodak Ektachrome 100. And this is at Waimea Canyon. It's kind of like the Grand Canyon of Kauai. Kodak Ektachrome color slide film. So unlike a lot of other film stocks, this was a color positive film, not color negative. So that's really cool. They call color film slide film because you can put it into a slide and put it into a slide player, a projector, and like play a slideshow. Because it's color film, it's not color negative. So my dad, who's a film photographer for many years, he has a projector and a bunch of plastic like slides. So you cut out each exposure, you put it into a slide, you put it into the projector, and the bright bulb shines it, and you can project it onto a wall, and it just looks like so good because it's film. There's no resolution, there's no pixels. It's just like the super fine grained film, and it's just as real life as you can create in an image. So it looks really cool. So that's why they call it slide film. With this, there was no foreground. It's basically, I was on top of a cliff on the other side, just looking down at the waterfall and at the canyon. So it was really just a point and shoot. I just set up my exposure correctly, kind of framed it and took the picture. And it's really that simple. I used this is on Kodak Ektachrome 100, so it's color slide film. And yeah, it's just a really interesting canyon with some red. So in this picture, it really is just the subject that makes it a good picture. I didn't center the waterfall, but I also didn't put it on the rule of thirds on the left side either. It's kind of somewhere right in between to give it some space, because it is kind of, the waterfall is coming from the left side to the right side of the cliff, so I wanted to give it some space to see that it kind of flows down to the right. And this is just a very small, 50mm shot of the big canyon, so I really had to kind of narrow down and choose what part with my angle of view to snap and to cut out of the bigger picture. So there it is, the Waimea Canyon and Waimea Falls on Ektachrome 100 color slide film. So now that I got one of those down, let's do scan another image on Ektachrome 100. All right, I'm gonna move on to another shot I took. So this was above the Nā Pali Coast on the very top of the cliff looking down. So I hiked the Kalalau trail to the Kalalau beach. This is kind of looking down on that beach from above, and you can't see the beach because it's out of view, the cliff's in the way. But essentially, if you look at a bird's eye view of the map, I was basically above at the very top of the cliff looking down where the Kalalau beach was. So this is just kind of a top angle. Really, this image really stood out to me as just a really beautiful, prominent image with just super fine grain. It almost looks like a digital image. Like I'm looking at it on my computer, so I guess it is digital, but before I edit or process it, it looks like I just shot this raw with like a Sony a7 II digital camera or something, just because it's so fine grain, you can't even tell that it's film, so it doesn't have as much of that grain or as much of that color negative look that you get with film. So if you didn't know any better, like, you wouldn't even be able to tell that this was film. It's just that it's such a high quality, it could compare to very high-end digital. All right, so just looking at this image, I just want to talk about the composition a little bit. So I used a shallow depth of field. If you look at the bottom part of the image, that's the closest to my lens. It's a little bit blurry. And then about halfway up the image in the middle and then further back is all in focus. So I was looking down, then you see the clouds kind of moving up the cliff. The ocean is the whole top half and top right corner, but it's covered in clouds a little bit. So you see a green cliff, mountain, and ocean in this kind of atmosphere with the clouds, and it's super fine grained, super high quality image from Kodak Ektachrome 100 color positive slide film, and I just really like it a lot. So now I'm gonna scan 2 images from Kodak Portra 400. So those of you that don't know, Portra 400 or 800, I think there's a 160, but the Portra film stock is designed and developed to get natural skin tones. So it's made for portrait photography on humans to get the natural kind of skin tones of human skin. But I find that if you're not using it for portraits, which it's great for portraits, it's really soft. It's a great color negative looking film. And I actually really like it for landscape photography. I don't use it as much as Ektar 100 if I want to get the color negative kind of film look, or if I want to get a professional, more slide color film, then I'll use a Ektachrome or a Velvia 100. But it's probably my 3rd favorite film stock. That's more affordable, I guess, compared to the Cinestill 50 daylight. But yeah, it's probably my 3rd or 4th film stock that I enjoy using for landscape and just daylight nature type photography. So I have a picture here from Kalalau Beach. That's the very end of the Kalalau Trail, 11 miles in on the Nā Pali Coast. And again, the only way to get there is to hike in. I don't think you can get there by boat just because it's a little bit aggressive from the ocean to actually get to the beach. I had some shade from the cliff on the left, some footprints in the sand, and then light on the sand, and then the ocean, and then the cliff. So I kind of had to arrange it all into this kind of composition that was all appeasing to the eye. Nothing is right in the corners. Everything has its own space, and it's just kind of a nice aesthetic, I think, overall, and mellow looking Portra. This other image we're gonna look at is also taken in the same beach, just looking the other direction, taken of my friends walking down the beach. I kind of use the rule of thirds basically to a point on this. The subject, the people in the picture about 1/3 up. You have kind of the cliff, the green cliff coming down on the top 1/3, and they're 1/3 to the right. So it's kind of just nice, even. There's not much room in the ocean. That's because I put the focus on the people. If I moved my composition to the left a little bit and got more of the ocean, then the people wouldn't have as much room on the right. So they're really the focus on this image, even though they're far away. But overall, I think it's a very nice composition and looks pretty good using the Kodak Portra 400. I shared a little bit about behind the images, the story of how I visited. We backpacked the Kalalau Trail using a permit. We camped 2 nights and 3 days. It was one of the most difficult hikes I've done at that time, yet it was one of the most enjoyable and rewarding hikes I've ever done as well. I definitely want to go back and do it again. Kauai was one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to, and it was one of the most enjoyable places to photograph with, and it helped me further develop my personal style of candid landscape photography, which is kind of the style I enjoy shooting and the way I would describe it using my medium format Hasselblad 500C. So it's a really, really fun trip, March 2020. So I just wanted to share some of that behind the scenes. Thanks for watching this video. I'm gonna have a gallery with all the images just back to back at the very end, just so you can see them. So yeah, thanks again for watching. You saw the images back to back in that gallery. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Comment below, let me know your thoughts on this video and some of the images, and if you have any experience shooting any of these film stocks from Cinestill or Ektachrome or Portra 400, or if you've been to Kauai yourself, or share one of the other places you visited, not where you live, but somewhere you've traveled to that you really enjoyed shooting, whether it be on film or digital. And yeah, just comment below, let me know. I love to engage with my audience and talk about those experiences. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.